Alright, what's up everybody? Back at this thing after a few months break because the world's crazy and I've been busy. But I'm back here with this video that I had stumbled across the other day. Heard a little bit of talk about it on Twitter. Not much. This thing didn't get as big as I think it should have because I thought it was very telling. And like, I'm not like in the... I got to be clear here on some of these things because it's really easy to group people into certain camps. Like you have the COVID is a conspiracy, COVID's not real, the pandemic aspect of it isn't even real. There's that crowd, then there's the other people that think like this is the fucking plague. This thing is going to be the death of humanity basically if we don't get it under control. I think both of those camps are ridiculous. Now, I'm somewhere in here where I'm like, dude, this is a really bad thing, especially for certain groups of people, but it's not the end of the fucking world. And it is certainly not a case where we just take a giant shit on everything we consider to be a natural human right in the country via lockdowns, via mandates, via any sort of talk of mandatory vaccinations or COVID passports or any of that kind of crap. I think that's all garbage. I'm a libertarian. You guys know this. So, this video here is Republican Jim Jordan in Congress grilling Dr. Fauci on some of these things related to COVID. And I think it's a really interesting exchange because it kind of gives you a bit more insight into really the two main different camps and how they view these things. Like, if we look at this now, we went from, 2 weeks to flatten the curve to now we've passed a year. And we're still doing this, and a lot of these places are still wanting to go even further with it. I heard some absolutely insane videos come out of Ontario from their government, basically bragging about having the strictest policy regarding COVID. But obviously, Fauci and the guys like Fauci want even more crackdowns. They look at a place like Florida, or they look at a state like Texas, and they think these places are fucking insane. They're not even close to mandating what we think is the right way to go about this. So this exchange is very interesting to see kind of the different takes that are really telling about how the different main camps in the country view liberty and safety. So let's check this out.
What measure, what standard, what objective outcome do we have to reach before Americans get their liberty and freedoms back?
You know, you're indicating liberty and freedom. I look at it as a public health measure to prevent people from dying and going to the hospital.
You don't think Americans' liberties have been threatened the last year, Dr. Fauci? They've been assaulted. Their liberties have.
I don't look at this as a liberty thing, Congressman Jordan.
Well, that's
I look
obvious.
At this as a public health thing.
All right, so right there, that is a pretty good example of the divide between the two major camps. One is focused on what can we do to make sure that the American citizen does not have their rights absolutely trampled by people in the name of public health. And this is one of the things that's been kind of depressing being an American in the last year. I mean, this last year has been so fucking crazy. It's taken me from a minarchist to straight up ANCAP because I have absolutely no faith in the paper of the Constitution. I have absolutely no faith in the voting demographics of the country. I have no faith at all in the system where your neighbors are going to get to decide what rights you have, if any, and under what circumstances. Because all it takes is people getting sick. All it takes is people getting sick, and they will wipe their ass with the entire thing. This last year has shown that. And I've argued with people who say they learned the 9/11 lesson. Now, the 9/11 lesson was where we looked back, after a couple of years after 9/11, we looked back and we were like, holy shit. Look at what we empowered the government to do. We empowered the government to shit all over our Fourth Amendment rights. We allowed them to detain citizens and people without even any sort of due process, without allowing them some of the basic rights that they had before 9/11. We allowed our government to murder people without trial. We allowed them to detain even non-American citizens indefinitely and outsource essentially torture programs under the guise of protecting the American citizen. And if that wasn't enough, several years later, Snowden came out and let us know, like, all of your shit is not private. The government's can look through at whim all of your shit, and if they just call you a terrorist, they can lock you up indefinitely. Now, that was supposed to be the 9/11 lesson. That was supposed to be what we learned, and despite being conservatives, despite being liberals, left-wingers, right-wingers, libertarians, whatever, the lesson we were supposed to have learned from that is we're not going to let that kind of shit happen again, where we get so scared and we're so worried about public safety that we're willing to give up our rights. And then COVID happened. And every bad thing we got from 9/11 was just amplified and spread out over the entire country. You had mass mandates, like even here in Texas, which is a red state, that you had businesses being fined $1,000 if someone was in the store without a mask. You have the restrictions on businesses, how many people they can have, if they're even allowed to stay open. The government determined whether you were or were not considered essential. People being given slips to show the cops if they're out on the road, because now you have to show your fucking papers if you're traveling. This is something everybody should be worried about. This was a gross, gross violation of what we consider basic human rights in this country, and both sides shit the bed on it. I mean, even now, the conservative-tilted Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the government in California cannot prohibit you from going to church. Now, that was a 5-4 decision. So the right side won on that, but they barely scraped by one vote over whether or not your basic right included in the First Amendment even applies, because some people are getting sick. And I'm not underplaying COVID. COVID's killed a lot of fucking people. But you still, when you're talking about in proportion, if this can happen over a 1% death rate, with a 1% hospitalization rate, where we know all the factors where comorbidities, the average person who dies from COVID has about 2.5 to 3 comorbidities, where if you have just COVID alone, only 6% of the people who have died had just COVID alone. The fact that the government can just say, you know, all this shit about your rights? Nah, we're not doing that now because people are getting sick. That should scare the fuck out of everybody, and that's what these conversations are about.
But
I disagree with you on that.
You think the Constitution is suspended during a virus, during a pandemic? It's certainly not.
But it certainly was. And most of you Republican guys in Congress were okay with it. There were Republican governors shutting shit down. Y'all just didn't want it to go on nearly as long as it has, and you don't want it to go on now. But you guys were okay with this in the beginning. Most of you were. And those of you who weren't, I applaud you, because I was against this from the beginning, because it's obvious what this leads to, what this opens the doors for. You don't want this. But yes, the Constitution was suspended, whether we like it or not. Some of your basic, fundamental, inalienable rights guaranteed to you through the Constitution, though I don't think you need a Constitution to have these rights. I think these are natural rights. But your right to assemble, your right to go to church, for instance, completely trampled because people were getting sick. That should tell you everything you need to know about the system. And it's funny because for the last year, I've been lectured on how basically American liberty is selfish. It's rooted in selfishness. The problem that these people have with it is that it's rooted in the individual and not the collective. That's really what the argument boils down to. It's because we're not putting society's needs ahead of the individual's liberty. And this is the fundamental difference between the thinking of a libertarian and the thinking of basically everybody else. That's an authoritarian mindset. You know, I'm not a huge Ayn Rand guy, but Ayn Rand actually said this best. The smallest minority in society is the individual. That has to be the starting point when we start talking about rights. Because you don't have collective rights, you have an individual right. Every right starts with the individual. So if your rights don't matter because the needs of the collective are bigger, then rights don't matter. There is no collective rights. So for the last year, when I've had people tell me that liberty is selfish, unironically referring to freedom as freedom, these are people that have been conditioned to see liberty as selfish. And they don't deserve liberty, if that's their take. They don't understand what it means and what it takes and what has to be sacrificed in order to not just have it, but to maintain it. That's where we're at. That's how weak society is right now. Where people start getting sick and we're like, oh God, lock the fucking doors. Let's everybody wear a fucking hazmat suit. And we're going to have to shut the entire fucking planet down to stop it from spinning because people are getting sick. In the future, there are going to be worse things than this. Undeniably, there are going to be worse things than COVID. But if they can do this for COVID, what the fuck can't they do this for? And that's the problem. Okay, so this thing goes on between Jordan and Fauci for a while longer. Jordan asked Fauci repeatedly about what the exact circumstances should look like before reopening can happen. Fauci is basically saved and defended by Clyburn, who says Americans can get their liberties back when 90% of Congress gets vaccinated, which is just retarded. And basically, Jordan has a few good moments. And he does good in describing what constitutionally guaranteed rights have been suspended in the name of public health, which are not limited to, but specifically he mentions businesses being shut down, people not being able to go to church, people can't assemble in their own homes with their friends and family, people can't go to loved ones' funerals, people can't see them on their deathbeds, people can't petition their government due to public access to public buildings being restricted to the populace. But the best moment, in my opinion, was from a separate video where Jordan asks Fauci his opinion as to why a state like Texas, which removed all of government restrictions over a month ago, has such low infection rates, while states with the tightest restrictions are at the top of the infections list.
You gave us a guess on Texas. Look at the chart here. This is 7-day average of case rate per 100,000 people. You gave us your guess on Texas. You said when Texas ended their lockdown, ended their mandate, that this was, quote, inexplicable and would lead to a surge in cases. Texas is near the bottom of the 50 states, but all the states at the top are lockdown states. So how great was that? That guess didn't seem to be too good.
But here's the best, though. So, I mean, obviously, yes, Fauci was dead wrong about what would be the direct results of Texas opening back up. I mean, the numbers show that. We've been open here for over a month now. About 5.5 weeks we've been open now. And the numbers have been consistently declining. Within the first couple of weeks, it was a 36% reduction in infections. And the numbers still show Texas is still in decline from where we were when the mask mandate was lifted. So obviously Fauci was not only wrong about that, but what's really interesting here is his explanation for why.
What explains why Texas is so darn low compared to the rest of the states? Lockdown states have a much higher case rate than the state of Texas, which is over a month ago now, said we're not going to lock down, we're not going to have all these mandates that you say we have to have.
Yeah, there's a difference between lockdown and the people obeying the lockdown. You know, you could have a situation where they say, we're going to lock down, and yet you have people doing exactly what they want to do.
Is that what is happening in the top 8 states in the country? They're just not following what's been told? They're not listening to Dr. Fauci?
I'm sorry, you're speaking so fast, I'm not even hearing what you're saying.
Well, you can look at the numbers.
I can't see that, it's too far away.
Okay, so you can't see it because it's too far away. You can't hear what he's saying when he's making a valid point. That is obviously a valid point that you should have to answer to, considering that you have had so much influence on these restrictions of liberties that he's talking about. Now, obviously that looks like a cop-out, but I'll give Fauci the benefit of the doubt. Well, get some glasses. Somebody hand him a transcript. Somebody say, please explain why the states with the tightest restrictions have the highest numbers of infections, whereas a lot of these states like Texas that have low-level restrictions have less infections. See, this seems like this would be contrary to what you said. And in fact, he actually already showed his cards here, because he said the reason for this is, I guess, in a state like California or New York where there are extremely tight restrictions, the people there just aren't obeying those restrictions. Which I guess the people in Texas, though they're not given those restrictions, are following the rules that they're supposed to follow, according to Fauci, tighter and better. But if that's the case, I guess that would be much more of an argument to get rid of the restrictions then, right? If the states with less restrictions are following the CDC guidelines more closely than the states with the restrictions, what, are they just doing it out of rebellion to not want to follow? Is that what the Californians are doing? Are we really expected to believe that the people in California and New York City are just not following the rules? That's what he's saying. That's his reasoning for this.
Okay, well, Michigan's at 551 cases per 100,000. Texas is at 77. Wisconsin's at 109 because their state Supreme Court overruled their governor, their Republican court, and said, we're not going to have a lockdown in Wisconsin. And their numbers are 5 times lower than the state of Michigan, which is right next door.
Gentleman's time has expired.
But, Mr. Chairman, it's typical when there's a question on the table that the witness gets a chance to respond to that last question. I want to know why. Why Wisconsin's at 109 and right next door Michigan's at 551. Michigan is locked down and Wisconsin isn't.
I think the gentleman answered you quite clearly.
No, he didn't. What the fuck? In no way did he even come close to answering that clearly. The one explanation he did give was that apparently the people in New York and California just aren't following the rules. And apparently the people in Texas and Florida are, even though the rules aren't imposed. Okay, well, even if that is the case, and that's a reason to get rid of the restrictions then, right? But he didn't. He said he can't see the chart and he can't even hear the responses. So no, this is again Clyburn trying to save the man, who's failing miserably. Like, we can see what this is. But you see, as soon as I say all this, everything you've seen in this video so far, if you're a left-winger watching this, you're scrambling for something to throw at this. So this is normally where a left-winger will accuse me of thinking COVID's not real, or the pandemic's fake, or the vaccine has a microchip in it. No, I don't believe any of those things. Why the fuck can we not find some kind of a reasonable middle ground where we're like, let's stop shitting on basic human rights and still be able to look at facts and evidence and use our reason to come to some kinds of conclusions to decide what is the best route to handle things? Because we've just passed a year into this bullshit, and there's really not an end in sight as far as the narratives go.